I'd like to ask the Chairman of the Manx Utilities Authority how much electricity is generated by renewable sources and whether Manx Utilities will reinstate targets for the proportion of electricity to be generated from renewable sources.
Chairman to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. The amount of electricity generated by Manx Utilities from renewable sources and purchased by us from the energy from waste plant operated by Suez Isle of Man varies from time to time. For 2018-19, the most recent financial year, the amount of renewable sources such as the Solby hydroelectric plant was 2.4 million units, supplemented by 24.6 million units from the energy from waste plant. This needs to be compared with the total island electricity demand of 406 million units. Renewable sources represent a 6.65 contribution to our total energy need. Over the last 15 years, there has been concerted move from oil to gas-based energy production. In order to achieve the broad all-island targets for emission reduction by 2050, the Climate Change Mitigation Strategy recognises that Tynwald expects Manx Utilities to shift energy supply from fossil fuel-based electricity generation to low-carbon alternatives. And the action plan therefore acknowledges that any replacement for our current gas-fired and diesel generation facilities will need to be near-zero emission alternatives. The Isle of Man's size means that it is dependent on a small number of power stations which are each able to independently supply a large proportion of local demand. This makes it difficult to efficiently transition to low-carbon generation sources in a gradual manner. As such, targets for renewable generation are unlikely to be either meaningful or achieve a good balance between reliability, cost and environmental impact of the island's electricity supply. Therefore, at the present time, towards the end of the operating life of the existing generation plants at Pulrose and Peel, it would be our intention, with the approval of Tynwald, to replace such capacity with the most economic, safe and secure low-carbon technology or technologies that might be available at the time. This approach is intended to ensure that we meet government emission targets by 2050. However, I wish to make it clear to this Honourable Court that Manx Utilities is committed to working with Government to ensure that cost-effective and environmentally sustainable power generation is achieved for the Isle of Man. Thank you, Mr. President.
Supplementary, Mrs. Caine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the MUA Chair for his comprehensive answer. I'd just like to point out and see whether he thinks it's a disappointment for the Isle of Man that in 2013, the 2 year ahead, the 2015 target was that 15% of electricity would be generated from renewables, and we seem to be falling well short of that still. How is he going to see that in stages the Isle of Man increases the level that is generated from renewables?
Chairman to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I've said in my answer, I think what we need is realistic targets rather than aspirational targets. One of the issues, as I've said, is that Manx Utilities has to deal with environmental concerns, and obviously today and in this sitting those are probably going to be paramount. But we also have to ensure energy reliability and the cost of that energy, particularly if we're going to drive the economy. So it's getting that balance right. I would share her disappointment that we haven't met that 15% target. However, what I would say is rather than 1% here, 1% there, when we do switch to renewable sources, we will be doing it in a block way by replacing current sources of energy generation which produce emissions with those that don't. And so I think that what you will see as we develop over the next decade and two is an incremental increase, but also a radical change in the way we provide electricity to this island. Thank you, Mr. President.
Remember, Mr. Boat.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the Chairman of Manx Utilities agree with me that we have an agreement with Ørsted, formerly known as DOM, for a 700 megawatt array in our territorial sea, but that it's being held up because we have no contract for differences agreement with the UK, and there are problems around that. But if that array were to come online, and it's not imminent, as pointed out on Max Radio this morning, then that would give us access to more energy, renewable energy, that we can use on Ireland, and that energy may well go to the UK, and then we would be able to re-import that. There's also an element of requirement for storage, which we don't have at the moment, and I think the Chairman would agree that being able to store energy from renewable sources, particularly wind and water sources, is important for the future.
Chairman to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd be foolish not to agree with the Minister on all his statements. I think he points out very clearly one of the problems with some of the offshore developments, in that a lot of them were backed by large subsidies from the United Kingdom government, which are now being withdrawn as they accelerate their position in terms of low emissions. And obviously, from an Isle of Man perspective, it would be very hard for us economically to match those subsidies without putting prices up really quite significantly for the consumer. However, as we develop into a low or zero carbon economy, we will have to take on board new technologies both on Ireland and off Ireland, and we will also have to consider how we generate our power, whether we do it ourselves, whether we contract with other companies to do it, and then sell on the excess and the surplus. If I can point out to honourable members that we already do export a large proportion of electricity during peak periods, and that extra income is used to overall subsidise the cost to the Isle of Man consumer. Thank you, Mr. President.